Alrighty. Should be seeing my screen. We should be good to go. Just moving some stuff around real fast. All right. Welcome back, everyone, and good morning. It's good to be with you all again, and welcome to our Totem Top 10 series. Thank you, of course, to Ohio SPDC for giving Totem Technologies the opportunity to come in and do this. We've definitely had an awesome time so far, and we are looking forward to rounding this thing out here pretty soon. And we've talked about a lot so far, and a lot of really interesting concepts. I hope you're finding that the things we've discussed so far aren't particularly difficult to implement. They're also not particularly expensive. They just take some time. And so we've talked about 5 controls thus far, and today we are going to be covering 2 controls in our Totem Top 10. We're going to talk about hardening system components, and we're talking about network segmentation. And with hardening system components, we're going to be looking at specifically how system hardening can be used to do what we would call reducing your attack surface, essentially meaning locking down the configuration of your various IT system assets and remediating vulnerabilities, reducing potential attack vectors within these IT system assets. And that's pretty much it. We're going to be doing a demo. I'm going to actually be hardening a Wi-Fi router for you guys, a TP-Link router right here. So we're going to be taking a look at that. Additionally, we're going to dive into network segmentation, specifically how chopping up our network into a bunch of different pieces can make it more difficult for adversaries to find what they're looking for. So we're going to discuss some methods for that, some different ways that you can segment your network and the benefits of doing so. And then, as always, we will continue to rely on our system inventory template as we have done so every week. So feel free to go grab yourself a copy of that if you'd like. You can find that on our free tools page. Let me go pull up the chat real fast. I'll stick that guy in there. If you have not yet visited our free tools page, this is a really handy resource, I think, where you can find lots of helpful resources for your cybersecurity needs, whether or not you are operating in the DoD space. The resource I just mentioned was the CUI and system inventory template. So definitely go grab a copy of that. You can do so for free on that page. And be sure to look at all the other resources we have on there. And if this is your first time seeing me, my name is Nathan. I am a cybersecurity engineer with Totem Technologies, and I have loved bringing this series to you all thus far. And I'm really looking forward to the things that we're going to discuss today and in the coming weeks. So would like to highlight some important changes to our agenda real fast. We're now going to be looking to wrap this guy up in a couple weeks, where we initially proposed that we would end this on the 6th of April. We are now going to be concluding in about 2 weeks. So for the next 2 weeks, including today and next week, we're going to be covering 2 Totem Top 10 controls each day. And then on the 23rd of March, we will cover the last control, collect and analyze event logs. And then we will do a sort of wrap up of the series. And we will go over everything we talked about pretty much and give you some final keys of advice or pointers, resources as you look to go from here. Obviously, I appreciate your flexibility as we enter into the final stretch of this series. And I think we're going to have a good time regardless. We're covering 1 control or 2 controls per session. We're going to have a fun time. So this does mean, since we're covering 2 controls and we did get started a few minutes late because of technical difficulties, we are probably going to go a few minutes over today. So I do apologize about that, but we love talking about this stuff, right? So what does that matter? I'm kidding, of course. As always, again, a quick review before we jump in. A recurring theme that we have seen over and over and over again throughout this series is that small businesses are prime targets for hackers. And this is due to a number of reasons that we have discussed in depth every single week, primarily that our systems tend to not be very secure. We may be relying on old or outdated technology or methods to using our technology that really are not the most secure way to go about doing so. We've talked about how our users typically are not trained to be able to identify and prevent even basic cyber threats, opening the door to a wide array of really dangerous attacks that could prove to be detrimental for our businesses. In fact, we've discussed how your users are actually your largest vulnerability, in that hackers are actively targeting your users more than anything else, more than the technology. In fact, they're using your users as a means to get to your technology. So we need to be sure that we are training our users on cybersecurity best practices and being able to become our greatest asset, go from being our most vulnerable asset or our weakest asset to becoming our most effective. And we've also discussed how there's this myth going around that small businesses are not, targets of hackers, that they tend to go only towards the big businesses because that's where the resources are. This is, of course, a myth that we've debunked multiple times, as we've seen just in the cybersecurity landscape as a whole. Hackers love small businesses because of these deficiencies that exist. It makes us easy targets for them. And so we should not be operating with the mindset that hackers don't care about small businesses, because they absolutely do. We've also discussed how cybersecurity, if you could boil it down to one thing, it would be risk management. There are simply way too many attacks out there, way too many threats, way too many vulnerabilities to be able to identify all of them and to be able to protect against all of them. This would be just way too expensive. Small businesses especially do not have the resources to do this. And so instead, what we recommend is we take what's known as a defense in depth approach to our cybersecurity. That instead of relying on, a couple really effective methods, that instead we are relying on multiple cybersecurity safeguards that are sort of layered together as part of our strategy, where in the event of an attack, if one safeguard doesn't work in preventing that attack, another one can step in and take its place. So our approach to this, when it comes to basic cybersecurity hygiene, is the Totem Top 10, which is why we're doing this series. And so that's why we're looking at 10 specific controls, and to sort of analyze how effective each control actually is in the real world. We presented an actual phishing example during session 0, our first session of the series, where we looked at what would have happened if a user had clicked on that invoice.doc attachment there, and just all the nastiness that came with that, and how an adversary could have used that to easily take advantage of our systems and install their own malware on it. And so every week we've been sort of looking through each Totem Top 10 control through the lens of this phishing attack and analyze, okay, well, what would this control have done to prevent or mitigate the risk of this phishing attack from being successful? And so that's been sort of our baseline as we moved along. And then last week we discussed administrative privileges and why it's important to restrict these from all of your users. Actually, we talked about how administrative privileges give hackers complete control over your network if they were to come in touch with them, and why default accounts are administrators, but most people tend to not actually know that. And so we need to be taking efforts to restrict these from our basic users, we recommended that one of the things you could do to mitigate this is to create a standard user account for all of your system users, and then engage a tool such as Windows User Account Control to sort of come in and support your standard users, so that even your IT administrator who would be running a standard user account can still use their admin privileges, just not on a full-time basis. So if you didn't have a chance to check that out or to tune into that, you can find that on YouTube. I believe you'll have to reach out to SBDC to get the link for that, but all of the recordings are up on YouTube, so they'd be happy to provide those for you. It's actually a really, really neat session, and I demoed how to engage user account control and how it works. So if you're curious about that, go check out the recording. This is where we stand so far in our series. As I mentioned, we have covered 5 controls so far, and the 2 that we're going to be covering today are hardened system components and segment your network. So let's go ahead and dive into our first control of the day, which is hardened system components. And this is kind of it can be kind of a confusing concept at first, at least it was to me when I first learned about it. And I think it's because it seemed kind of vague to me. But here's how I understand it best. Hardening is essentially the process of taking a given system from its perhaps default or maybe even current and vulnerable state and making it secure. So you've got any given IT system asset, it's in a vulnerable state, whether that's its default, straight out of the box, or its current state, whatever that might be, however it's configured, and trying to make it secure. That's the best way that I can think of explaining system hardening on a very surface level. And so what this means is it means identifying potential attack vectors or avenues of attack through that given system and remediating these. Essentially asking, okay, what vulnerabilities exist within this system, or what configurations within the system could allow an adversary to take advantage or compromise that given system. And so you could tie system hardening into several of these other controls, like enable multi-factor authentication, which is our 9th control of the series. That would technically be a way that you could harden a system. But for the sake of this control, we're looking at it from sort of a more broad sense. So what should you be hardening? Well, like I said, you should be hardening your IT system assets. So this would include your workstations, your servers, databases, applications, operating systems. Again, really anything that's part of that IT system asset scope that you would have identified during our first control of the series, know your assets, when you put together your IT system inventory using that spreadsheet that I mentioned. This is where you can identify your scope, and so you should know what you need to be hardening. And so refer to your system inventory spreadsheet to know what you should be hardening. Well, why exactly do we need to harden? I mean, don't these producers, these vendors care about my security and take the necessary efforts to secure their products? Well, not necessarily. And actually, I blame us, the consumers, for that, including myself. And that's because typically when a vendor is creating a new piece of technology, they have the end user in mind, right? They want to make sure that their product is simple to use, so it's easy to sell, right? If it's super complicated, then it's going to be tougher to sell. This means that there's a trade-off, because the downside is that security and convenience typically are trade-offs of one another. So the more security that you have with a given product, or the more secure a product is, it usually is less convenient, less easy to use. And so the producers, the vendors recognize this, and they don't want to create a product that's hard to use. And so because they want to sell the product, right? Think of like, signing in with multi-factor authentication, for example. That is an extremely powerful technology, and we know that it makes whatever system we're using more secure in protecting our information, but it is another step to signing in. And so it's a little less convenient. So with the consumer in mind and not security, at least not security where it should be, there are many vendors out there who do care about security. But at the same time, they're trying to balance that trade-off. But this means that we are purchasing products that maybe are not as secure as they could be. And in fact, in many cases, these pieces of technology that we will purchase will come with default configurations that actually are not the most secure and do open the door to a wide variety of different attack vectors. And so there are many different ways that we could choose to go about this in terms of addressing these default configurations, because these really are what we need to be looking for. If we're just purchasing a piece of technology and immediately throwing it into our environment, that's not a good idea. If we're not first taking a chance to look at the product and see how we can harden it, how we can make it more secure because of these default configurations. And so what do we do? How do we get started? Well, this process is obviously going to involve developing some sort of secure configuration settings. And we know that we need to take this given device from its default or current vulnerable state and make it secure. So probably the best way to start, in my opinion, would be to choose a security baseline, one that has been put out by either the vendor of the product themselves, because hopefully they know the product best and know how to secure it best. That's not always the case, but the vendor may themselves have security baselines for securing their product because they themselves recognize that it's not as secure as it could be. And so we recommend that you would choose a security baseline out there to use as sort of a guideline for securing that given system. And these baselines, like I sort of mentioned, could be either vendor specific or they could be more broad. For example, Microsoft Windows has tons of different security baselines for securing their products. And these baselines could be applied to different products as well, not just Microsoft products. So baselines could be specific to a given asset, they might not be, but we do recommend that you choose a security baseline out there. In fact, I have another link here to the Windows security assets. You can read a little bit more about their use specifically within a Windows environment. But I think you'll quickly find that actually these are good practices that I could apply across other devices, not just Windows. And basically what you could do is you'll go and you'll pick a baseline, and you may export the baseline as a spreadsheet, and then you could just go through step by step, and it will tell you, make this configuration here, make this configuration here, change this, remove this, flip this switch, et cetera, et cetera. From what I've seen, it tends to be very step by step, which actually is nice. But super helpful tool if you have not already considered system hardening or looked at security baselines before. It's really neat, actually. And so give it a look. And it's also not too difficult. Again, like with most of these controls, they just sort of take time. And so give that a look if you haven't yet. Well, I'd like to demo actually an example of system hardening. And I'm going to be hardening a TP-Link Wi-Fi router, which I've got right here. I hope you can See that it's a standard, pretty standard router. It's a nicer one, probably nicer than you'd find in the average home for sure. But we're going to go ahead and look into this guy and see what sort of default configurations are in here that we need to change. And we do have a standard, very basic list of what you should be looking to configure at a minimum in terms of system hardening. And so we recommend that you change default credentials. You look to disable unnecessary or insecure services. And this is kind of broad. I mean, obviously it depends on whatever the asset is. In this case, we are hardening a router. So we're going to be looking at unsecure encryption algorithms like WDP. We're going to look at unnecessary services like WPS, and I'll explain more about those when we run into them. So because of that, we're going to be looking to engage the strongest encryption algorithms available. We are going to require MFA where we can. It's not always the case that we have the ability to do that, but we want to if we can. And then we want to synchronize time via the NTP with the domain controller. So we want to make sure that it's reading the correct time. And I'll explain why when we come to that in the hardening demo. But this is what we recommend on a very basic level. Definitely encourage you to check out some of these security baselines to get a better idea of what is best practice on a much larger scale, because there are a lot more things that you can do to harden besides just what we have listed here, but this is a great place to start. So I'm gonna make sure I can get into my router real fast before I attempt this live. Okay, looks like it's still up. So basically what I did is I just plugged this guy in, powered it on, and the networks that I can connect to will appear. And so I connected to it. And so I now have the ability to move into the administrator console, which is what this looks like. And it says, welcome to the TP-Link wireless router. Please log in. The first time that you break this guy open and you sign into it, you are going to be given a login similar to this, except it's going to ask you to provide an already created or an already existing set of credentials. And what those are is those are default credentials. In fact, for this particular router, it's pretty easy to find what those are. The username and the password are both admin. And you could find that by Googling online. So that's the very first thing that you're faced with, and that actually TP-Link routers force you to do. So that's nice. That is, we are already on our way to hardening this router, and TP-Link has helped us with that because they're requiring us to change the default credentials. Keep in mind that this is not always the case with your standard router or whatever device. The vendor may not have a process in place to require you to change these default credentials. And the reason that we need to change these is, A, they're usually administrator credentials, and so they have complete control over the device, like we talked about last week, the things that you could do with administrator credentials. So you have complete control over the device, and those credentials are easily Googleable. You can find them easily online. I could search TP-Link and then the model number admin credentials, and there they are. So we need to be able to change default credentials, which I have already done. Please let us in. And here we are. So this is what the administrator user interface looks like. And so there's lots of stuff we could dig into here. I'm primarily concerned with the advanced features here, because this is where we're going to be able to really see everything and be able to change whatever we want. And so step one was to change default credentials, which we did. So check. The next thing we want to do is we want to disable unnecessary or insecure services. And so I'm just going to work my way through this and see if I can find where we can do that. So it's probably not going to be in any of here. It's probably going to be under wireless. Okay, so wireless settings, this is important. This is our network name, the SSID. You may see that as well. That's just the name of the network that you see appear when you're trying to connect to that network. It gives us the opportunity to rename it if we want. And I would actually encourage you to do that because, again, this is a default SSID that has been provided to us. And so maybe I'll change it to something like, if I'm running a company and my company is called Nathan Company Corp or something like that. Just something different from the default. And also we will leave it so that we are not hiding it. We are not hiding the SSID, so it's actually visible. The security, this is the encryption algorithm setting that I mentioned. I had mentioned on the slide that we wanted to disable specifically WEP. WEP is an outdated encryption algorithm. I think it was developed probably 25 years ago or so, and it's not secure, and so it's not recommended to be used today. And so we want to change it to a more secure encryption algorithm that is not WEP. And so TP-Link also helps us out by recommending WPA/WPA2-personal. So you can see they do recommend that. And that is indeed the encryption algorithm that we want to roll with. The most recent encryption algorithm that you may see out there is WPA3, but this TP-Link router does not support that. So we will roll with the next best thing, which is WPA2. So we will select WPA2-PSK, which is essentially pre-shared key, which is essentially that the password that you use to authenticate yourself or that you use to connect to the network. We're not using any sort of like pre-generated PIN or default PIN. We're not just hopping onto the network without any sort of password or anything. We are being provided a pre-shared key by the owner of the network. Essentially, think of it like you go to your friend's house and want to connect to their network. They are the owner of that network, and so they have a password, a pre-shared key that they will share with you to connect to that. Encryption, we will roll with AES. This also is an extremely powerful encryption method that we will want to use, and it is enabled by default, so we won't touch that. Password, this is the actual password to connect to the network. So when a user will see Nathan Company-Corp, they will need to enter in whatever password I set here. You hopefully know the basics when it comes to passwords. Adding, and actually there's a lot of debate over this, but short passwords are not good. Individual passwords, like a given word, also is not good. There's a debate over whether long passphrases versus shorter but more complex, meaning more just sort of random characters throughout the mix, is more secure. Just change it from the default and add some complexity in there and some length. That's all I would ask, please. But so all of these things we're going to need to change, and we're going to need to make sure that they're set up correctly, because they may not be with any other given system. You may fire up a router and find that it's running WEP and it's an open system and it's only using a 64-bit key type. So extremely easy to hack is what that means. And so we need to change it to something better. So we'll do that. So we'll save it. I didn't change the password, but we'll assume I do that. And I change it to something super duper secure. Let's see what else we can find in here. Come on, buddy. And my router died. Let me disconnect and jump back in. I think you guys have come to expect that for every live demonstration, there is at least one or two blunders. So I appreciate your patience. Trying to support a Zoom call and a PowerPoint and a live demo is a lot for my computer to handle, apparently. We'll jump back in. I don't think it's going to let me back in. Try one more thing. And if that doesn't work, we will just move on. Time to refresh. But I think it makes sense what I'm recommending. Just take the basic recommendations that I provided and go through whatever system you're trying to harden and do exactly what I'm doing. Just go through, yeah, timed out. Go through step by step and see what sorts of changes that you can make to that system to improve its security. Start with our basics, but definitely recommend that you check out the security baselines that maybe Microsoft has out there or someone else, some of the industry standards, and see how you can make your IT system assets more secure. Again, the most dangerous thing that you could do is purchase a new product like this router and just plug it right into your network without doing anything. That's definitely not a good idea. And so this is a good place to start. So sorry that demo didn't really pan out how I had envisioned it to, but I'm not gonna fight the live demo gods. It's a bad idea. So, but all of these things that I had listed here, besides the require MFA, because this router did not support multi-factor authentication, we could have done pretty easily in that administrator console. In fact, we could have done all of this within probably, if I knew what I was looking at and what I was looking for, probably around 10 minutes. So it doesn't really take a super long time. So that's hardening system components in a nutshell. I know we didn't go into super deep detail, and I do apologize for that, but I think hopefully you understand at least the basics when it comes to that control. So at this point, if we've implemented all the Totem Top 10 controls in the order at least that I've presented them, we have just hardened our workstations and our servers and everything else to reduce the risk of an adversary compromising them, right? But what do we do in the event that an adversary actually does get a hold of one of our workstations? Are we just supposed to surrender our network to them and let them have their way? Well, I hope the answer is no. If your answer is no, that's not what we want. Can't just wave the flag of surrender just because they've breached enemy line or breached our lines for the first time. So hopefully we'll have some additional protections in place to be able to protect us in the event that breach does occur. And now most folks, when they spin up a business for the first time and they set up their network, they typically will create what is known as a flat network. And this is essentially akin to fighting on a flat battlefield. So you can see in the picture here, there are really no obstacles nearby. There's nothing, there's nowhere to take cover. So an adversary can essentially see everything around them and move in whatever direction that they choose without any issue. There's no hills, no trees, no boulders, no nothing. And so it's really easy for them to go wherever they choose. in terms of a network, in terms of a flat network specifically, it's essentially the same idea in that a flat network is one in which all of your IT system assets are within easy virtual reach of one another. Meaning that if an adversary were to compromise, your workstation, they could easily reach out to and communicate with, say, your file server or your database server, where really important information is being stored. They have virtually no challenge on a flat network doing that because communication is typically open. Since all of the devices on that network typically are on the same subnetwork, meaning they all share a similar IP address and they're all able to communicate with each other. This opens the door to some pretty easy movement on the adversary's part. And so just think about it a little more. If we have an open network, that means, well, not an open network, a flat network with open communication. That means that, your workstation can communicate to, like I said, the file server, which can also communicate to like your CEO's iPad or, to that treadmill that you have upstairs, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of those devices are potential avenues of attack to that network. An adversary could breach any one of those. And so what they will do is they will find, they will target the weakest link in that group, which is probably one of those weird IoT devices that you really shouldn't have on your network, or that should be segmented, as we'll talk about today. But a flat network gives adversaries multiple avenues of attack and really just opens our network up, our sensitive information up to be compromised. We're not doing ourselves any favors by operating on a flat network. And so this makes it really, really easy for them to do so. And so we need to do something about it. And the solution that I would recommend to you all today is to segment your network. And essentially what this means is it's exactly what it sounds like. We need to chop up our network into different pieces. And we recommend that you logically divide your network into similar groups of assets. And by logically, I mean you can segment your network through technical means without having to actually like physically move anything or group anything together. So there are other ways that you can do this without actually having to physically move your assets. So we recommend this approach. And there are a couple ways that you can actually segment these assets. And first being, you can group these by type. For example, you can group all of your workstations together. You can group all of your servers together. You can group all of your peripheral devices together, like your printers or servers. You can group your security devices together. And that's a pretty common approach from what we've seen, at least for small businesses. You can also group by function. For example, you've got your human resources department and all of the assets within that group. You've got your engineering department, all the assets within that group. You've got finance, you've got, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I assume I'm talking to mostly small businesses here. And so, we all wear multiple hats. That's just part of being part of a small business, right? And so the simplest way in my mind to segment your network when it comes to small businesses, making it work in a small business environment, is to segment by type. So by workstations or servers. So there are lots of ways that you could start to do this, but like I said, consider segmenting by type. I listed some examples here on the screen of how you could begin to do that, those groups. And then you could also establish like a corporate wireless. You could establish a guest wireless for visitors, as visitors should not be connecting to your corporate wireless, because then you are entering them into the fold with everyone else, and they have the same capabilities on that network as just about anyone else. And so we definitely don't want to allow our visitors access to our corporate wireless. We want to create a separate guest wireless for them to do so. And I wish the TP-Link demo went a little better, because I would have shown you how you could have done that. But that is one way that you can actually harden a given network, is by creating a guest network, by segmenting it to allow for that. And so these are just some ideas that I'm throwing out there to get you thinking of how you could begin doing this. Now, there are multiple ways that you can actually accomplish network segmentation. One is, and this is probably not going to be the case for most of us, but one thing that you could do is you could literally, like, physically air gap between different segments. And we have actually seen this with some of our manufacturing clients. For example, if you were to run a machine shop and you have these huge, pieces of machinery that are used to build some given product, you may just decide to leave those guys off of the network entirely and physically, disconnect them from pretty much everything, meaning they're not plugged into any given network. You couldn't try to communicate with that machine if you tried from some other computer from some other part of the office. It is physically disconnected from everything. And there are two reasons why we've seen our clients do this, is because first, the machines don't need network access to, perform its job. There are other means that can be used to accomplish whatever tasks it has. And B, these machines are typically running on pretty old or pretty outdated operating systems that you should not be running on any network, like we talked about with our fourth control, patch software and operating systems. And so it would be a significant cybersecurity risk to bring these guys onto our network. And so we definitely don't want to do that. And also, it's really expensive to update these huge machines. And so they typically will choose to just air gap them, meaning completely physically disconnect them from anything else. And there are other, if you are specifically a DoD contractor pursuing like NIST 800-171 compliance, there are other compensating controls that you'll need to put in place in order to actually become compliant with that approach to network segmentation. But it is an option. Probably not something most small businesses will do, but yeah, it's an option. Additionally, you could create separate, or you could purchase multiple switches, which is just I'll show you more what a switch does in a second when I pull up a network diagram. It'll make more sense. But essentially, before each segment that you've grouped by type, your workstations, you will have a switch in front of that will connect to the router. And then with your servers, you'll have a switch in front of those that will connect to the router. So that is one approach, is where you just have multiple switches designated for each segment. But this is, you're purchasing more hardware, so this could get expensive. So definitely one approach to do it, but not the only option. In fact, what we see most of our clients doing, and honestly what we would probably recommend for small businesses, is that you would create what is known as a virtual local area network, or VLAN. And you create several of these based on the asset groups that you identified earlier. And VLANs are exactly what they indicate. They are a collection of assets that have been logically partitioned and then isolated together onto their own local area network, a virtual local area network. And so your IT staff can create these partitions on your network switch, and they can assign each VLAN their own specific unique subnet. And so essentially what that means is the devices within that VLAN will be communicating with one another, and whatever else your IT administrator has designated it to communicate with. So this gives you a lot more control over your network, and it's kind of similar to software whitelisting, where the goal is more control over our environment. This is one approach, and honestly a pretty popular one to that. And I know this is probably confusing, especially if you've never heard this term before, but the most important thing for this, and I think this will make more sense when I pull up a diagram here in a moment, but just understand the benefits of network segmentation, which I have here. Essentially, by isolating our network assets onto different segments, or maybe different VLANs if we've chosen that approach, is that we have added multiple obstacles for an adversary to have to overcome if they wanted to move throughout your network. If they successfully, compromise a workstation on your workstation VLAN, they may realize what's going on and decide it's way too much effort to try and navigate through this, and I'm just not going to do it. But hackers typically aren't, if they're trying to take the effort of breaching your entire network, they may not just stop there, right? They're going to try and do more. And another nice benefit of network segmentation is that it actually forces an adversary to make noise, meaning that to move from a given segment to another is going to require a lot more in-depth scans on the adversary's part. It's going to potentially require changes to the configuration of that network, because they can't get out of there unless something is changed, something within that network is changed. And so they may look to compromise an administrator account so that they can have the credentials to do that, to make those changes. And all of these things together, they're walking across tripwires here. Like it's very likely that they are going to trip an alarm at some point, assuming that we have some sort of event log and network monitoring process in place. And so again, what network segmentation is, it takes our network from a flat battlefield like I had in that first image, and it turns it into something like a forest, or rolling hills, where you've got all of these different obstacles. And so we've made it a lot more difficult for an adversary to move around without someone seeing it and stopping it. And so, as I mentioned before, this all, of course, is dependent upon you actively monitoring your network. And we're going to talk more about this with our 10th control, which is to collect and analyze event logs. But without this in place, these two controls layered together, it's tough for it would be tough to know when an adversary is actually in your network. Our segmented network may have been effective in preventing them from going anywhere, but we may not have noticed, which isn't good when it comes to incident response. We want to be able to respond to an incident. We want to be able to gather all the information that we need and have all the information that we need. And so we want to see these two controls working together. And this network monitoring capability, this is something that you actually can outsource to someone like a managed security service provider, or MSSP, where they will essentially take what is known as a security incident and event management tool, and they will use that to monitor your network and report you when suspicious activity is taking place, or when they are noticing potential indicators of compromise. So we utilize an MSSP here at Totem because we know that we need it, and it has saved us on multiple occasions. So I recommend that you consider layering those two safeguards together. But I did want to, hopefully this is where it all sort of starts to come together. I put together these very basic network diagrams to help us sort of understand the difference between a flat network and a segmented network. On the left here is a flat network. This would be one local area network. Let me, this would be one local area network. As you can see, each group that we have here, they are all part of the same IP subnet, meaning they all have very similar IP addresses. And so it's very likely that they are able to communicate easily and openly with each other. If I'm on a workstation, I can easily communicate with my servers. If I'm on a workstation, excuse me, I could easily communicate with the printers. In that same vein, if an adversary were to compromise a printer, they would easily be able to reach out to our servers and, begin to wreak havoc. And this is something where an attack like ransomware actually is, we see the worst of it on flat networks. Because if an adversary were to compromise a workstation, their path to everything else to begin spreading the ransomware is easy, because they can see everything, they can access everything, and it's open access essentially. So we definitely do not want that. This only exacerbates the problem and continues to fuel attacks like ransomware. So on the right here, we see an example of a segmented network. And in this case, the segmented network utilizes VLANs. So as you can see, each group, again, we grouped by type. So we kept our workstations together, our printers together, our servers together, etc. We have lots of different VLANs. Each VLAN has their own unique identifier. And they also all have their own IP subnet. So you can see these are all different. So what this means is that we have significantly reduced the attack surface of this network. We've made it so that if an adversary were to compromise a printer, they would not so easily be able to reach out to our server and try and pull our sensitive information off the server, or try to move laterally throughout the network as they try to find whatever they're looking for. So again, this sort of approach, by isolating everything separately, we've made it more difficult to move throughout the network and increase the chance of an adversary tripping an alarm, because our MSSP will have rules in place to be able to detect specific, when specific attacks are taking place. They will know, okay, this is a segmented network, and someone tried to move, a basic user just tried a privilege escalation attempt and they're trying to reach out to the database server. That is definitely not normal user activity. And so we're going to flag this, and we're going to let the customer know. And so they can immediately begin to move into incident response mode and get that adversary out of there. And so it's hopefully good to see the Totem Top 10 coming in clutch here. I hope one other point that I'm making here is that the segmented network, it's a very effective approach, but it's not the only thing. It's not the only control that we need to have in place to protect our network, to protect our sensitive information. That's why we have a 10-part series for basic cybersecurity hygiene, because this is not the only piece to the puzzle. We need to be hardening all of these devices. We need to be restricting administrative privileges across the board. We need to be patching all of them. This really is a team effort here. And so we can't just be relying on any one specific control. But to do this, to segment your network, again, it doesn't take a lot of time, but it also doesn't take a lot of resources, but it may be a challenge at first just to identify, well, how do we want to segment our network? But ultimately, it should be pretty easy to do. And if you need some help just with ideas or how you'd actually go about segmenting your network, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to point you in the right direction as to how you can start doing that. But this is a rudimentary example because I know that all of our networks are different and they're very complex. Some of them are very complex networks. And so we need to be strategic in how we segment them. And so it's not going to look as simple as this, but this is to just highlight the effectiveness of network segmentation. So I hope that is starting to make sense and you're starting to see the benefits of this control. And so, in the event of like a phishing attack, and feel free, if you have any questions as we wrap this guy up, feel free to stick them in the chat. In the event of that phishing attack that we got hit with during session 0, how would hardening system components, we'll start with the first control, have helped us in that event? Well, take, for example, if we had hardened our Microsoft Office applications and not allowed them to run to run any macros within that given program, unless being given explicit permission to do so, the adversary would not have been able to take advantage of that vulnerability that existed within the Microsoft Word equation editor. So that would have helped reduce the risk of this attack from being successful. By segmenting our network, if the user was not an administrator, and we saw that invoice.doc attachment did require administrative permissions. If the user was not an administrator, they would have likely tripped some alarm as they tried to achieve privilege escalation to move from one basic user account to an administrator account. And so because we had segmented our network, we had made it far more challenging for an adversary to do that. And so again, reducing our risk of that attack from being successful. So this brings us to the end of our presentation. I feel like at the end of these, I've just overwhelmed you all with a lot of technical information, but this is honestly like, this is where to start. And this is like cybersecurity is, I get that it's new to a lot of people and it can be challenging to understand, but hopefully you're starting to see the value in this. And please know that if you have questions as to how you'd actually implement any of these, feel free to get in touch with myself or our team at Totem Tech. We'd be more than happy to help walk you through any of this. So we only ended up going a few minutes over, so thank you all for your patience. It probably would have been about 10 minutes longer if the hardening demo went a little smoother, but is what it is. So are there any questions for me as we close out our session for today? Any questions? Well, again, feel free to check out our free tools page if you haven't already. Check out some of the resources that we've created that may be of benefit to you. And we would love to see you again next week as we cover 2 more controls. Again, we'll cover our 9th and 10th control next week. And then the following week, March 23rd, we will wrap up the series and we'll all be on our way with a basic and effective cybersecurity plan in place, right? So thank you all for tuning in, and I will catch you next week. Thanks, Brandon. Appreciate that.